Kalimera. Welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid A-Level Greeks. The sun's shining, I'm wearing a toga and we're all trapped inside. And today we're going to look at the analytical aspect of the Sicilian expedition between 415 and 413 BC. We're going to put it finally to bed. You don't have to have listened to the previous two episodes, but it will certainly help. So we should really start by looking at the Sicilian expedition in the grand scheme of things, in the big picture. Now, as we've suggested in previous episodes, the Sicilian expedition is not dissimilar to the Athenian expedition to Egypt during the First Peloponnesian War. Like the expansion into Egypt, the Athenians again are overstretching themselves. They cannot stop looking beyond the hill. The Athenians definitely always think that the grass is greener on the other side, and the way to get a one-up on the Peloponnesians is to look further beyond. We know it didn't work in the First Peloponnesian War at all. We've got these ridiculous notions of pushing triremes through the desert, but arguably the Sicilian expedition is far more dangerous. Athens is already in a weaker position before Sicily than it was before Egypt. Egypt arguably seemed like the next natural progression. If you remember, it was the follow-on from Chimon's policy of chipping away at the Ionian states, weakening the Persians to the point where they capitulate, and they very soon after did surrender. So this was the Egyptian campaign can be seen as relatively natural in terms of its development. This really is not. The Athenians are already set on the ropes. They've lost at Mantinea. They've lost any traction they gained at Pylos or Sphacteria, and now they are riskily heading off over the ocean, off to the sea, to gain new allies and new resources. And this really exposes a weakness in the Athenian goal, or this obsession with expansionism. They've already expanded right across the Adriatic Sea. They've taken pretty much all of the Ionian coast, most of the Cycladian islands. There's only so far they can expand. And the problem with this expansion is the more you do it, the further you have to go. And the longer it takes to get there, and the harder it is to get supplies to and from. Arguably, you could liken this to the expansion of Rome and that ultimate collapse due to geography, but obviously there's far more things going on. But expansion cannot be continual and everlasting, and the Athenians learned this really quite quickly and quite harshly. And then we certainly, in the sources, you see this kind of harking back to the ages of Pericles and his more cautious approach to not expanding unnecessarily, and certainly we'll come to more about that later. But in the big picture, realistically, in this final chunk of the Peloponnesian War, what the Sicilian expedition does is it really damages Athens' ability to wage war. It's not quite the hammer blow that will completely destroy Athens, but it is certainly a huge drain on their resources, on their men, on their wealth, on their will to continue the fight. Again, the Athenians were already to some extent on the ropes before Sicily. After committing vast numbers of men, ships and resources and losing them, they are really weak. They are now effectively the three-legged dog trying to fight the Spartan war machine. So when we look at the events of the Sicilian expedition, particularly the big event, the Siege of Syracuse, we can look at it through a couple of different lenses, but the obvious one to look at is, well, to what extent are the events of the Sicilian expedition a Spartan victory or an Athenian failure? And obviously, if we're talking about Spartan victory, we are using the term very loosely. The majority of the soldiers involved were not Spartan. There were Sicilians, there were Peloponnesians there, but realistically we're looking at the key role of Yipus. So if we look at the idea of it was a clear Spartan victory, we've got to look at how we justify this position. And again, it revolves around Yipus. His presence, we know as soon as he arrives, he has the effect of not only sending panic to the Athenians, but he certainly boosts the morale of the Syracusans, and he galvanizes their will to fight. They see he turns up, and all of a sudden they are more inspired, or so we're told. He manages, while he's arguably his presence, or the fact that the Spartans are here, it almost silences the factions within Syracuse who want to negotiate with Nicias. This has always been a perennial problem for any Greek city-state in any protracted war. There's always someone or some people within the city-state who are willing to go the other way to the main sway of the government. We saw it very, very early on in the course with those two people in Eretria who, when Darius's forces turn up on the way to Marathon, threatening to burn everyone down, the two guys who decide, actually no, we'll open the gates and let them in. What's the worst that can happen? They get burned. So Ippus's presence in Syracuse seems to subdue any will to negotiate with the Athenians. If it not subdue, makes it less popular. But when he's there as well, don't forget he's a general. He's there to win wars and win battles, and he does oversee some significant victories, interestingly, on both land and sea. And this is a bit of a new venture for Sparta. They've traditionally not been that involved in any kind of naval conflict. Where they have done, it's not really been their thing, even if we think back to people like Eurybiades during the Persian Wars, who, despite being the hegemon of the combined Greek navy, effectively took a backseat to Themistocles. But his victories are significant in Syracuse. They're not all significant. They're not all decisive. He does end up with some stalemates, but we've got to look at things like the fact that he completes the counter walls. He takes the Athenian walls where he can, and he manages to outmaneuver them, outbuild them, to the point where any Athenian blockade or siege is useless. Similarly, he takes the southern fortifications during that naval battle. He takes those three forts, cutting the Athenians off from the south. All the time, whilst it's Syracuse who's meant to be being besieged, he's squeezing the Athenians into this little swampy area. He's almost flipping the siege back on them. Like I said, they're not all decisive victories. He does have some wins and some losses. His night attack doesn't necessarily work very well the first time, but you could argue that being a good leader, he takes it on the chin, rather than blaming his men or the gods or a squirrel that looked at him the wrong way. He says, that was my plan, it's my fault, and he moves on from it. He works on, and he becomes more and more successful. It is also quite interesting that of all the generals that were active during the Peloponnesian War on both sides, Ippus echoes through the histories. He becomes one of these better known generals, arguably because he is successful, but more interestingly because absolutely he conducts a combined attack on Athens' strength on both land and at the sea. So once we've addressed the issue of it being a Spartan victory, we should also address the idea of Athenian failings. And arguably there are more of these than there are reasons for Spartan victory. And because of this, we'll start at the end, particularly around the events of the Siege of Syracuse. Now, one thing we can definitely say, where we've seen Ippus's quite dynamic, eager leadership, on the other side, we're told Nicias' leadership is often pretty sluggish. It's regularly commented on that he is not eager to fight this fight. He didn't actually want to be in Sicily. If anything, he can seem more of a caretaker general. This was Alcibiades' plan. Obviously what happened with Alcibiades happened, and Nicias is left in a position that he does not want to be in. He repeatedly sends messages to Athens asking to withdraw, and repeatedly is denied. He does not think it's a great idea. Now, we can't just throw Nicias under the bus, because we do have to remember he is becoming increasingly ill during these campaigns. He's suffering quite badly, and to say his mind's not 100% in the game, that would be a fair comment. But either way, from the start, he's not eager to fight. He's seen as a sluggish caretaker of an army. He's not going to be pushing the dynamic leadership, taking the risks that Iapus does. But, to be fair to Nicias, Demosthenes also has to take a bit of a hit here. Demosthenes, the hero of Pylos, even when he arrives, everyone thinks, "Oh, this is the tide turning. This is it. The Athenians have sent their greatest general. This is the man who beat the Spartans at Pylos." And he turns up like this great action hero who's going to solve the problem. But even he cannot dislodge Iapus's forces. Yes, he has some initial victories, takes back the heights with his shock troopers, but is ultimately beaten back. You know, he is unable to break Iapus's siege lines. Whether it was already too late by the time he arrived is another question we could ask. But ultimately we can say that the Athenians, like the Spartans at this point, are not great at protracting a siege. They have failed to cut the Syracusans off, and they are struggling to take back any of these fortifications that the Syracusans under Iapus have taken back from them. Another thing we could point to in terms of how it all went terribly, terribly wrong for Athens is you could even suggest they are becoming a bit too cocky when it comes to their naval power. Throughout the majority of the century and the conflicts we've seen with Sparta, the Athenians have been the unrivaled powers of the sea. The Spartans have always had this kind of vague disinterest in naval warfare. It doesn't fit into their notion of hoplites and being glorious dying in battle. You know, it's not that glorious rowing a ship, so they've never been fully engaged in naval warfare, which has allowed the Athenians to some extent to become a bit overly confident, a bit cocky and a bit lazy. They've become a bit fat and chubby round the edges, thinking no one can touch them at the sea. Now obviously the Syracusans had different ideas, and using these Corinthian ideas brought by Iapus to attack the Athenians in the narrow harbour, they actually completely give the Athenians a spanking, which is probably a real shock to the Athenians. And then obviously if we're looking at leadership, we've got to talk about this bad omen. Yes, the lunar eclipse is an obvious bad omen to the Greeks at the time, and yes, the seers will have been important, and obviously the generals wouldn't have wanted to be heretics, especially given the religious shenanigans that happened before the expedition even set off. But seriously, to wait for 27 days whilst you know you are not going to win, you are simply using up your resources, giving the enemy more time to observe you, watch you packing up and prepare to chase you across Sicily, that's got to go down in the history of dumbass moves during a siege. Had they left earlier, would it have ended better? Arguably, it's difficult to say. It couldn't have been any worse than what actually happened. Again, they probably would have had more supplies. They would have been able to make more of an immediate exit and leave the Syracusans wondering what happened. But really, obviously the religious importance is there, but don't wait 27 days to run off. Just do it. So we've established that the siege of Syracuse was not well fought by the Athenians. It was not planned well, it was not executed well, but neither was the entire expedition. And a lot of this ultimately has to sit on the shoulders of Alcibiades. It was ultimately, this whole thing is his idea. Is it a bold plan? Yes, absolutely. Did the Athenians need to start thinking out of the box? Well, to some extent. Was it a wise plan? Nope, not at all. He comes up with this grand plan, this epic expedition. It's almost something straight out of the Odyssey, or straight out of the Trojan Wars. The combined fleet's going to sail off and take the city and come back with spoils and riches, and then, just as it all gets underway, he legs it, leaving Nicias in charge, because if we are to believe the accusations, he's been fiddling with bits on statues. So he comes up with this plan, he gets everyone to go along with it, and then he runs off. And again, Nicias, in these early stages, he needs to take some of the blame. Yes, Alcibiades came up with this crazy idea that they're going to sail halfway across the Mediterranean to attack an island where they didn't really know who was there or what was there. They had limited information. But Nicias, he needs to take some blame as well, because rather than putting a strong argument of we don't know what's there, he chose the other suggestion. Rather than ultimately, I'm trying to think of a good word, rather than openly denouncing this idea and wanting to be that guy who doesn't want to do the thing, he tries to save face, and he takes the approach of tricking the assembly into asking for more ships and more men than they would need. So realistically, it's his fault that so many Athenians are sent to Sicily and so few come back. Had he simply said we should send an expeditionary force first, let Alcibiades go with a smaller group, meet an ally, fortify that ally, would have been much more sensible, rather than saying, he's almost trying to bluff his way out of doing this expedition. And obviously once we get there, we know he's not really a dynamic commander, he's not leading from the front, he realises early on that this is a mess. The Senate, however, also needs to take some responsibility for this complete catastrophe. It's very easy to just turn around and then to blame Alcibiades and Nicias, but they were the ones who agreed to it. They were swayed by this smooth talker. It's not pointed out as much in Thucydides, certainly with not the same level of venom, but we see a pattern emerging once we see these cracks in good leadership. Where we've seen previously with the Mytilene debate, the Senate was swayed by Cleon to send troops and ships to Mytilene to burn the city to the ground. Obviously they came to the senses the next day and did away with that idea. But here again, either through Alcibiades' own personality, his presence, his contacts, his aristocratic background, or the fact that they were just short of a good idea, the Athenian Senate are relatively easily swayed on some very flimsy arguments to commit to this expedition. Not one of them, as far as we're aware, really starts to question whether this is a good idea. They don't question whether they know enough about Sicily to commit such a big force. They literally just agree with Alcibiades because it seems like the right thing to do, and no one wants to be the doubting Thomas. And again, once things are underway, they don't just stop. They don't at any point go, hang on, wait a minute lads, was this really a good idea? We don't seem to be doing very well. They keep sending troops, they keep sending money, they send Demosthenes, who surely could be better employed in Greece at the time fighting the Peloponnesians. They send Demosthenes to sort it all out, and he doesn't. It becomes very, very quickly a quagmire into which they can't get out, and the way the Athenian Senate are trying to get out of this is they're simply filling this swamp with troops and men. Their solution is send more ships, send more men, thinking they have an inexhaustible supply of these, which we know they don't. And these failings from the very beginning of the expedition really act to highlight and root out what we can see as an ongoing problem with Athenian leadership. We've seen previous leadership has steered Athens through some very, very tricky times. Sometimes they're arguably far trickier than the situation facing Athens at the start of the Sicilian expedition. The Persians are not banging down their doors, the Spartans are not occupying their lands. So the leadership previously, we can see, has been arguably significantly better. The obvious example that everyone will point to is Pericles, and particularly he's seen as the complete opposite to Alcibiades in this situation. His policy of caution, staying behind his walls rather than risking expansion, is seen as beneficial. He built the walls for a reason. He knows he cannot necessarily continually expand. He concentrates on developing Athens, so he's seen as a good example of sound and solid, cautious leadership. I mean, alright, his plan of staying behind the walls during plague years, probably not the best idea, but even he realised that when he caught it. But he's less risky, he's less of a loose cannon. Similarly, you've got people like Aristides and Cimon, who offer a more balanced approach to expansionism. Absolutely, with the creation of the Delian League and Cimon's campaigns in the Ionian states, they were expanding, and they were expanding quite significantly. But they had more of an idea of what they were doing. They had the will of those they were going to liberate behind them. They knew this. They had clear ideas of what they were there to do. But most importantly, whilst they were expanding, whilst they were taking these opportunities, they were particularly keen, Cimon particularly, in maintaining peace with Sparta. To try and expand an empire in such far-flung corners of the world whilst you're at war with a very strong neighbour who is a lot closer to you than these places you're going to, would have been a disaster. So Cimon and Aristides show this balance of caution, sensible expansion. And then we can even look at people like Themistocles. He is the risk taker. He is clever, but he takes a lot of risk. And his treatment of the Hellenic League forces and the naval powers, even back to building wooden walls, building ships, he is a risky character, but he's a well thought out risky character. He does exactly what he needs to do. He sees the situation, he manipulates it to what he thinks is going to be the best solution, and ultimately, he sees off Xerxes. But skip forward from Themistocles, forward over 50 years, we get to 415, we've been through Cimon, Aristides, Themistocles, all kinds of people have been ostracised from Athens. And because of the long effect of the war and ostracism and the changing nature of Athens, we can suggest that Athenian leadership really does seem a lot weaker. Alcibiades is a bit of, he is a flimsy character later on. But at this point, he's almost kind of a bit of a kind of playboy character. He's more interested in his own self-aggrandizement, creating his military legacy, getting a nice fancy uniform or a shiny helmet he can wear to impress people with, rather than thinking strategically about the success of Athens. We can suggest that clearly he has limited dedication to Athens, because as soon as things start going wrong, he runs off to Sparta. He is certainly portrayed as this kind of character. He's no Cleon, let's make it very clear. Thucydides does not pile into him as much as Cleon, but he's certainly not spoken with any great reverence. And again, even Demosthenes, the hero of Pylos, the Greeks' greatest general, arguably, if we wanted to be mean and pick on him, we could say, well, he was only at Pylos by accident. He'd stopped off on a much longer journey, saw an opportunity that he could exploit, exploited it, and became victorious as a result of it. And certainly, as a general, he was able to defeat the Spartans. Yes, brilliant. Cleon did take credit for his achievements, absolutely. But it still seems very much kind of haphazard. They are more reactive rather than forward thinking, which you could possibly argue is why the Athenians decided this harebrained scheme to attack Sicily might have been a good idea. They were reacting to things thrown at them. And of course, with any good ancient history thing, we've got to consider the sources and the nature of the sources. And as with most of the Peloponnesian War, our main source we need to look at is Thucydides. And on that point, yes, you can dig out all the usual things about Thucydides as an author. He follows this Greek logical tradition. He is a scientific historian, unlike Herodotus. He doesn't include tall tales, random stories, or things about ghost dads. He's logical, he's thorough, he's detailed, he's structured, he's well researched, absolutely, and he is critical of the things he reads. He tries to be as objective as possible. Certainly with the Sicilian expedition, we can say, given the amount of pages he dedicates to this thing, he's almost showing by volume, he's showing the reader that he thinks this is a significant event. And absolutely, it is very precise, it is very detailed, it is definitely one of the more reliable accounts of the conflicts, but his level of detail is very Thucydidean, excessive almost. But at the same time, as well as, if you've read Thucydides, he can be a little on the dusty side. But with the Sicilian expedition, we almost get an air of the poet coming from him. He does some relatively good storytelling, if not storytelling, but war reporting, let's call it. I mean, his description of the latter stages of the siege of Syracuse and the retreat are quite uncharacteristic. I mean, they're not Herodotus with the little quips of Dionysus at Thermopylae or tales of people escaping on dolphins. He's not, or the Corinthian ghost ship at Salamis. He's by no means that fanciful. But you do get the idea that he sees this as, again, almost like something out of the epic poems. The soldiers sail off to a far off land and fight tooth and nail and then ultimately die. But it's within this whole remit of Thucydides being the logical historian. But saying that, he is not without his issues, and we do have to be quite careful taking some of Thucydides' inferences as gospel, although he is relatively balanced in how he does this. As we've seen with the discussion of why it went the way it did, he's back to picking out Athenian failings, and for an Athenian this is not uncommon in Thucydides' work. He's always picking out faults in Athens, arguably more than other city-states. We know this because right from the very beginning, even when we go way back to the start of the Pentacontatia, he starts by clearly saying the whole of the Peloponnesian Wars, the root cause was Athens and their expansionism. And obviously this is going to be a really strong, huge example that he can use to push his narrative, not his agenda, but his perspective. He blames Athens. He also, again, as we've said, nowhere near as much as how he piles into Cleon. He also starts to throw a bit of shade at Alcibiades. It's nowhere near as explicit, but Alcibiades is portrayed as certainly he's no Pericles. Without openly saying Alcibiades is a disastrous leader and a disaster for Athens, Thucydides sows the seeds by pointing out he's not particularly bright. He's a bit of a chancer, is more accurate. Clearly, to be at this level of chancer, you've got to be quite bright. But yeah, he doesn't see him as a noble leader or a sensible leader. And don't forget, at this time, Thucydides has already been exiled from Athens. We can't necessarily say this is his grudge match piece, but it certainly would influence how he writes things, or certainly how he gets access to information. It's not like he can just pop into Athens and see what everyone's getting up to. He was previously a general, but that access to that information is going to be gone now. But he certainly seems to have done his research, and he's very detailed in what he does. Interestingly as well, with Thucydides, as we've seen previously with his kind of fondness with which he writes about Brasidas, he gives fair treatment to the Spartans, particularly Iapus. He sees the Spartans more and more, it seems, as a noble enemy. Their commanders are often written about as people Thucydides looks at in admiration, particularly in comparison to the Athenian leadership at the time, Cleon with Brasidas, Nicias and Demosthenes with Iapus. It's almost like he looks across at the battlefield and thinks, God, we'd do so much better if we had them in charge instead of this idiot. So he writes with this almost fondness. It's not quite, he doesn't, he's certainly not betraying Athens, but he writes with a respect for their enemy. So ultimately, Thucydides' description, whilst being arguably the most reliable thing we have, there are pitfalls, as there are with any ancient writers. So, there you have it, the Sicilian expedition, arguably a complete disaster for Athens. Whether it was down to their own failings or a Spartan victory, that's for you to decide. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been useful, informative and not too tedious. Leave a comment below and we look forward to seeing you again.